My son said to me, "There's no room for you here. Get out." So I left, smiling. The next day, he lost everything. The first thing you notice about a house like that isn't the size or the floor-to-ceiling windows that stare out at the rolling hills of Austin. It's the silence, a deep, sterile quiet that swallows sounds a normal house would make. My son Kevin's mansion, a cathedral of polished concrete, white walls and glass, was a masterclass in that kind of silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes an old man like me feel loud just by breathing. I'm David, by the way. I'm in my early 60s, and for the past year, this museum had been my home. I spent most of my days in the garden. It was one of those professionally designed landscapes that look better in magazines than in real life. All sharp angles, ornamental grasses, and rocks placed just so. There wasn't a single plant in it that you could eat. I'd be out there in my simple work pants and a faded polo shirt, pulling the few stubborn weeds that dared to defy the high-dollar landscapers. I liked the feel of the Texas sun on my back, the familiar ache in my knees. It reminded me of a time when my hands were useful for more than just holding a coffee mug. "David, the service takes care of that," Jessica, my son's fiancée, would say. Her voice, always polite but edged with steel, would drift from the massive sliding glass door. She never called me Dad. "You'll get your clothes dirty." Jessica was all sharp lines, just like the house. Sharp cheekbones, sharp business suits, a sharp mind that was always calculating. She was an executive at some PR firm, and she saw their life, their relationship, even me, as part of a brand they were building. I was the off-brand element, the scuffed, comfortable shoe in a closet full of stilettos. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen, a vast white space with an island the size of my first pickup truck. A handle on one of the minimalist cabinets was loose. It was a simple fix, a minute's work with a screwdriver. I'd built entire houses from the ground up, and the jiggle of that handle was like an itch I had to scratch. I opened a drawer, looking for a toolbox that I knew wasn't there. Kevin walked in then, one hand holding his phone to his ear, a black rectangle that seemed glued to him. He was tall, dressed in a ridiculously expensive t-shirt and jeans that probably cost more than my first car. He was closing a deal, pacing the length of the kitchen, his voice dripping with the effortless arrogance of a young man who's never known real failure. No, the valuation is locked. We scale from here. The Q4 projections are solid gold," he said, gesturing with his free hand. He saw me fiddling with the drawer. He lowered his voice, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Tell your guy to call my guy. We'll circle back." He hung up. "Dad, what are you doing?" "This handle's come loose," I said, holding it up to show him the wobble. "Just looking for a screwdriver." He sighed, a long, dramatic sound. "Dad, please don't. We have a facilities manager for that. I'll just put a ticket in the system." He pulled out his phone again, his thumbs flying across the screen. "You'll probably strip the screw or scratch the finish. This is Italian lacquer." It was the way he said it, not with anger but with a weary condescension, like explaining a complex concept to a child. I was just a walking liability, a bumbling old man who might mess up the pristine surfaces of his perfect life. My own company, the one I built for 40 years with sweat and calloused hands, had started with rusty nails and second-hand lumber. I'd built hundreds of homes, real homes, where families lived, and kids scuffed the floors, and cabinet handles came loose from being used, not from just existing. "You know, son," I tried, my voice softer than I intended, "in my business, if you saw a problem, you fixed it. You didn't put in a ticket." He barely looked up from his phone. "Dad, this isn't your rusty nail construction business anymore. We're a digital empire. A digital empire." The words hung in the silent, air-conditioned space between us. I had sold my construction business and retired a few years back, and I'd used a significant chunk of that money to give him his start. He called it seed funding. He seemed to have forgotten where the seed came from. In his mind, he was entirely self-made, a genius who had conjured this empire from thin air. I just nodded and stepped away from the cabinet. There was no point. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday night. Kevin and Jessica were hosting a dinner party. Two venture capitalists, men in their 40s with easy smiles and hungry eyes, were the guests of honor. Kevin was trying to secure another round of funding, and the whole evening was a performance. The food was catered, the lighting was professionally adjusted, and the conversation was a carefully curated stream of buzzwords: disruption, market share, user acquisition. I sat at the end of the long dining table, feeling like a piece of antique furniture someone forgot to put in storage. I tried to stay quiet, to be invisible, but one of the investors, a man named Marcus, turned to me. "So, David," he said, his smile genuine, "Kevin tells us you're retired. What was your line of work?" "Construction," I said simply. "I built homes." "Oh yeah? A real builder. I respect that. My dad was a plumber, hardest working man I ever knew." And just like that, he had opened a door. I saw a flicker of humanity in him, and I made a mistake. I thought I could connect. I started telling a story, a simple one from my early days. It was about a young couple whose financing fell through halfway through their first home build. I told him how I finished the job on my own dime, letting them pay me back slowly over the next couple of years, without interest. How they brought me a home-baked pie every Christmas for the next decade. It was a story about trust, about people, about a handshake meaning more than a contract. As I spoke, I could feel Kevin's entire body tensing up beside me. He was staring at his plate, his jaw clenched so tight I was surprised his teeth didn't crack. Jessica had a frozen, brittle smile plastered on her face. The investors were polite. They chuckled, said things like, "Wow, they don't make 'em like you anymore." But the folksy, heartfelt story had punctured the sleek, corporate bubble Kevin had so carefully constructed. I had brought the scent of sawdust and honest labor into his sterile world, and he was mortified. The moment the investor's car disappeared down the long driveway, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, filled with unspoken rage. Kevin stood in the middle of the cavernous living room, his hands on his hips. Jessica stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed, a silent, supportive statue of disapproval. "What was that, Dad?" Kevin's voice was low, trembling with fury. "What was what? I was just talking to Marcus." "Talking? You were telling campfire stories, handshake deals, and Christmas pies. Do you have any idea how that made us look? We're trying to project an image of being a cutting-edge, billion-dollar company, and you're in there acting like we're running a small-town hardware store." "I thought it was a nice story," I said, my own voice quiet. "It's about character." "Character?" Jessica finally spoke, stepping forward. "Kevin, this is exactly what we were talking about. The brand is everything. This doesn't fit the brand." Kevin looked from her to me, and it was like her words were the final permission he needed. His face hardened, all the youthful softness gone, replaced by the cold mask of a CEO making a tough decision. "She's right," he said. "This isn't working. We're building a brand, a future. Look around, Dad." He gestured at the stark, empty space. "There's no room for you here. Get out." The words hit me, but not in the way he expected. I looked at my son, at this angry, arrogant man he had become, standing in a house paid for by foundations he didn't understand. I looked at Jessica, her face a mask of triumph, and a strange sense of calm washed over me. It was the calm of a decision finally made, of a painful test finally concluded. My expression, I'm sure, was unreadable for a moment. Then, a slow, knowing smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who was about to reset the entire board. "Okay, son," I said, my voice steady. I turned without another word and walked to my modest room. I pulled a small, worn duffel bag from the closet, the only thing in that house that was truly mine, and packed a couple of changes of clothes, a book, and my wallet. It took less than 5 minutes. When I walked back to the front door, they were still standing there, watching me. Kevin looked confused by my lack of argument, but also visibly relieved. Jessica just looked victorious. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't offer any last piece of fatherly advice. I just opened the huge, heavy front door, stepped out into the warm Texas night, and pulled it shut behind me. As I walked down the long, perfectly lit driveway, I was still smiling. My son thought he was kicking me out. He had no idea he had just handed me the key to his own eviction. The morning after I walked out, the silence in that big, white house, must have been exactly what my son, Kevin, had craved. I can picture him now, waking up in his king-sized bed, the California-style windows showing a perfect, cloudless Austin sky. No sound of me pottering in the garden, no smell of the simple coffee I'd brew, no presence of the man he saw as a living, breathing relic of a past he was desperate to escape. I heard later that he shared a smug, satisfied look with Jessica over breakfast. They'd done it. The old man was gone. Their future, a sleek, uninterrupted runway to success, was finally clear. He felt, for the first time, truly liberated and powerful. He mistook silence for peace. He straightened his $1,000 tie, grabbed his briefcase, and headed out, ready to conquer the world. The first stop, as always, was the artisanal coffee shop downtown where they knew his order by heart. A large Americano, black. He pulled out his corporate black card, the one with the company name, Innovatech, embossed in silver. The barista, a young kid with piercings and a cheerful attitude, ran it through the machine. Beep. A frown. He ran it again. Beep, beep. "Sorry, Mr. Miller," the kid said, looking uncomfortable. "It's declining." Kevin just scoffed. Annoyance flickered across his face, nothing more. A system glitch, an overnight server reset, whatever. These things happened. "Fine," he snapped, pulling his personal wallet out. He paid with his own card, grabbing the cup without another word. A minor inconvenience, a tiny pebble on his superhighway. He didn't know it yet, but that little piece of black plastic was the first thread to be pulled from the tapestry of his life. He arrived at the gleaming glass and steel tower that housed Innovatech's headquarters. He strode through the lobby, giving a curt nod to the security guards, who always greeted him with a respectful, "Good morning, sir." He headed for the private executive elevator, the one that went straight to the penthouse floor, his domain. He held his security key fob up to the sensor. A red light blinked. Access denied. He tried it again with more force this time, as if that would make a difference. Red light, access denied. A flicker of real irritation, now mixed with a cold prickle of confusion, ran up his spine. He turned and marched over to the main reception desk. The receptionist, a woman named Sarah whom he'd hired himself, suddenly found the computer screen in front of her intensely interesting. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "Sarah, the executive elevator isn't working," he said, his voice tight. "Oh, yes, Mr. Miller," she stammered, fiddling with a pen. There was an urgent corporate directive issued this morning from the holding company. You should check your email." The cold prickle turned into a spear of ice. The holding company? He barely dealt with them. They were just a name on a piece of paper, a legal structure I'd set up for him to get started. He never gave them a second thought. "Check my email?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. But Sarah was already looking away again, her face pale. He took a step back from the desk, his legs feeling strangely unsteady. The bustling morning lobby suddenly felt like it was closing in on him. He pulled out his phone, his thumb shaking slightly as he navigated to his inbox. And there it was, an email with a subject line that made his blood run cold. Formal notice of termination of employment and access revocation. He opened it. It was from a legal firm he'd never heard of, representing the Miller Family Trust. The language was cold, clinical, and brutal. It informed him that, effective immediately, his position as chief executive officer of Innovatech was terminated. The reason cited was a material breach of the founder's succession protocol, specifically Article 4, Section 2, the Character and Legacy Clause. His access to all company systems, communications, bank accounts, and properties was revoked. The phone felt heavy as lead in his hand. The world tilted on its axis. He could hear the hum of the lobby, the ding of the public elevators, the chatter of employees walking by, but it all sounded like it was coming from underwater. A breach of the founder's protocol? What on earth was that? Panic, raw and pure, finally broke through his arrogant disbelief. He stabbed at his phone, dialing his chief financial officer, Mark, a man who, just yesterday, would have dropped everything for his call. It went straight to voicemail. He tried his chief operating officer, voicemail. He tried his head of sales. The call connected. "Hello?" the man answered, his voice strained and formal. "It's Kevin. What is going on? Did you see the email?" There was a pause. "Kevin, I can't talk about this. I was instructed that all communications are to be directed to the Trust's legal counsel." "Instructed? Instructed by who?" Kevin yelled into the phone, turning heads in the lobby. "I have to go," the man said, and the line went dead. He was locked out, frozen out. He was an outsider in the empire he thought he had built. Humiliation and rage burned in his chest. He stormed out of the building, past the guards who now watched him with a mixture of pity and fear, and ran to his car, a top-of-the-line Tesla that was one of his proudest possessions. He sped home on the freeway, his mind racing. This had to be some kind of insane corporate takeover, a hostile, illegal move. He'd call his lawyers. He'd sue them into oblivion. This was his company. He built it from nothing. When he turned onto his pristine, tree-lined street in the wealthy suburbs, the sight that greeted him stopped his heart. A huge moving truck was parked in his driveway. Two men were carrying his designer sofa out the front door. On the perfectly manicured lawn, a realtor was hammering a "for sale" sign into the ground. He slammed on the brakes and bolted from the car. "What are you doing? What is going on? This is my house," he screamed, his voice cracking. The realtor, a calm woman in a sharp suit, turned to him with a professionally sympathetic look. "Are you Kevin Miller?" she asked. He nodded dumbly. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, consulting a tablet. "The property's sole owner, the Miller Family Trust, has placed the home on the market for immediate liquidation. We've been contracted to empty and sell the property." The Miller Family Trust, there it was again, that name, that phantom entity that was tearing his life apart. And then the words hit him like a physical blow. Sole owner. "No," he whispered. "No, the deed is in my name." The realtor gave him a sad little smile. "I'm afraid not, sir. The trust holds the deed. It seems you were living here under a beneficiary agreement, an agreement which, according to our files, has been terminated." It was then that Jessica burst out of the front door, dragging a sleek, expensive suitcase behind her. Her face was a mask of fury. "I tried to call you," she shrieked, her voice high and panicked. "They're taking everything, the furniture, the art. A man is here to repossess the car. Kevin, what is happening?" He just stared at her, the full, catastrophic truth finally dawning on him. The house, the car, the company. It was all smoke and mirrors. He didn't own any of it. He was a character playing a role, and someone had just ended the play. Jessica saw the dawning horror and understanding on his face. Her own expression shifted from panic to cold, hard calculation. "Wait," she said, her voice dropping. "The trust, your father, don't you own any of this?" She looked from the moving truck to the for sale sign, to his shell-shocked face. "You have nothing?" He couldn't even speak. He just stood there, a statue of a broken man, her face twisted in disgust. "I hitched my wagon to a fraud," she spat. She pulled out her phone, her thumb moving expertly across the screen. Within a minute, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Her Uber. She threw her suitcase in the trunk without a backward glance. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She just got in the car and it drove away, leaving him standing alone on the pavement, watching his entire life get packed up and hauled away. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, with nothing but the designer clothes on his back and the slow, crushing realization that he had never truly owned a single thing. He sat on the curb that had been a part of his pristine, manicured lawn less than an hour ago. Now it was just a strip of concrete bordering a property that was no longer his. He was still wearing his $1,000 suit, but the jacket was wrinkled, and there was a smudge of dirt on one knee. His impeccable hair was a mess where he'd been running his hands through it in frantic disbelief. Beside him was a single cardboard box, the kind you get from an office supply store. It held a framed photo, a couple of industry awards, and a charging cable for a phone that was now just a useless piece of glass and metal. The digital king, dethroned and exiled to the pavement. I watched for a moment from my old pickup truck, parked a block down the street, hidden by the shade of a large oak tree. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the kind only a parent can feel. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was a heavy, necessary sorrow. Then I picked up my simple flip phone, the one he always made fun of, and dialed his number. He answered on the first ring, his voice a ragged bark of fury and desperation. "Who is this?" "Kevin," I said, keeping my voice low and even. There was a sputtering sound, a mix of a gasp and a curse he choked back. "You," he seethed. "You did this. Whatever this is, you did it. How could you? What did you do to my company, to my life?" I let him vent, his words tumbling over each other in a torrent of blame and confusion. He was a cornered animal, lashing out at the only thing he could think to blame. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke again. "Meet me," I said, "the Corner Booth Diner, out on Highway 71. You know the one. The diner? Are you kidding me? I don't have time for this. I have to fix." His voice trailed off as the reality of his situation crashed down on him again. He had nothing to fix. He had no access, no power, nothing. "I'll be waiting," I said, and hung up before he could argue. The diner was exactly as I remembered it, and exactly as he would hate it. The air hung thick with the smell of frying bacon and coffee that had been brewing for hours. The red vinyl on the booths was cracked in a few places, and the jukebox in the corner was playing a Patsy Cline song that was older than I was. It was real. It was honest. It was everything his life wasn't. I was already in a booth by the window, a cup of black coffee in my hands, when he stormed in. He looked even worse under the fluorescent lights. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. He threw himself into the seat opposite me, his lone box of possessions clutched in his hands like a shield. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice a low, trembling hiss. "You called some old friend on a board? You pulled some ancient string? You destroyed me to get back at me for a stupid argument?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. The heat was grounding. I set the heavy ceramic mug down with a soft click. "Kevin," I began, my voice quiet but filling the space between us, "you built your whole identity on being a self-made man. You believed it. You sold that story to your investors, to Jessica, to yourself. The problem is, it was never true." He stared at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? I built NextGen from the ground up with a startup loan." I almost smiled. "A startup loan, yes. From who? You never questioned it, did you? The paperwork said it came from a private equity firm called MFT Capital. You were so eager you just signed." I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, son, what do you think MFT stands for?" The color drained from his face as the pieces began to click into place in his sharp mind. "Miller, Family Trust," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. I nodded slowly. "I never retired, Kevin. Not really. When I sold off the last of the big construction contracts, I didn't just put the money in the bank. I converted the entire company, its assets, its capital, its legacy of 2 generations of hard work, into a formal holding trust. Miller Construction didn't die. It evolved. It became the bank that funded your dream." He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. "The company, but I'm the CEO. It's my name on everything." "I gave you the title of CEO," I corrected him gently. "I put your name on the door. The trust owned 100% of the voting shares. That gleaming office tower? The lease is held by the trust. The servers that run your digital empire? Assets of the trust. That house, the one you threw me out of, was purchased by the trust as a residence for the acting CEO. It was never yours. You were a manager, son. A very well-compensated manager, but a manager nonetheless. I gave you the keys to the kingdom to see if you had the character, not just the skill, to one day truly rule it." The rage was gone from his eyes, replaced by a hollow, sickening understanding. "In the trust's charter," I continued, "the document that forms the legal bedrock of everything we own, there's a clause. I wrote it myself years ago. It's called the Character and Legacy Clause. It states that the primary beneficiary, the CEO, must uphold the values upon which the family's fortune was built: humility, gratitude, and respect for the foundation." It gives the sole trustee, that's me, the right to remove the beneficiary and reclaim all assets if those values are publicly and personally betrayed. I paused, letting the full weight of it settle on him. You told me there was no room for me in your house. The thing is, son, it was always my house. You were so busy building your brand, you forgot the man who laid the foundation. The man who poured the concrete and hammered the nails that paid for your first computer. You didn't just kick me out of a home, you kicked out the core principle of the entire enterprise: respect. And you did it in front of the very investors the trust was counting on you to impress. You breached the clause, Kevin. You broke the deal. He just sat there, motionless, his hands resting on his pathetic little box of memories. The arrogant tech mogul was gone. In his place was just a boy, my boy, looking at the complete and utter wreckage of a life he had believed was his own creation. The full, crushing weight of his arrogance had finally broken him. The silence in that vinyl booth was heavier than any words we'd spoken. It hung in the air, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and grease trap cleaner. Kevin just stared at the spot on the Formica tabletop where his invisible empire had evaporated. His face, which hours ago had been a mask of arrogant triumph, was now a pale, slack canvas of disbelief and horror. The kid who thought he was a king had just found out he was only a prince, and he'd just spat in the true king's face. I took a final, slow sip of my coffee. It was black, bitter, and honest. Everything my son's life wasn't. I placed the heavy ceramic mug down on the saucer with a soft click, the sound echoing in the funereal quiet between us. I scraped my chair back. "So that's it?" he finally croaked, his voice raw. "You're just, what? You're going to leave me with nothing?" He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, desperate, and for the first time in 10 years, he looked like a lost little boy instead of a corporate shark. A part of my heart, the fatherly part that never really goes away, ached to pull him into a hug, to tell him it was all a terrible mistake, to give him back his keys and his credit cards. But I couldn't. This wasn't a mistake. This was a correction. I reached into the pocket of my old denim jacket. My fingers closed around a piece of metal, its edges worn smooth from years of turning in locks and being held in a hopeful hand. I pulled it out and placed it on the table between us. It wasn't shiny or impressive. It was a single old-fashioned brass key, tarnished with age, the kind you'd see in a movie from the 70s. It slid across the table and came to a stop right in front of his clenched fists. He stared at it, confused. "What's this?" "That," I said, my voice steady, "is the key to the first workshop I ever owned. A little cinder-block garage out on the industrial side of town, near the rail yard. It's where I started, with a toolbox I inherited from your grandpa and a second-hand F-150 that coughed more smoke than it had horsepower. Everything you lost, every dollar, every stock option, the company, the house, the seed for all of it was planted right there, in that dusty room, with my own 2 hands. I looked him straight in the eye, letting the weight of my words settle. There was no anger in my voice, only a profound, unshakable finality. "I'm not giving you a single dollar, Kevin, or a place to stay, or forgiveness. You don't get to have those things right now. But I am giving you a starting point. It's the same one I had." I buttoned my jacket. "If you want to start building something that's actually yours, you know where the tools are." And with that, I walked away. I didn't look back. I felt his eyes boring into my back, a mix of fury and utter desolation. The little bell above the diner door jingled softly as I stepped out into the cool Texas night, leaving my son alone in the booth, with nothing but a cheap cup of coffee and the key to a past he never knew. I didn't follow him. I didn't have to. The apathetic universe has a way of teaching the lessons you refuse to learn from the people who love you. The next few weeks, as I pieced it together later, were a brutal education for Kevin. The first few nights, pride was his only blanket. He slept in the least luxury sedan he'd arrived in, until the repo company, dispatched by the trust, found it in a mall parking lot and towed it away while he was inside trying to use a maxed-out credit card to buy a bottle of water. That night, he was truly on the street. All he had left was an old beat-up Honda Civic from his college days, which had been parked and forgotten at his old apartment complex. He'd had to talk a very skeptical security guard into letting him retrieve it. That car became his world, his home. He'd wake up in the pre-dawn chill, windshield fog from his own breath, the smell of stale fast food hanging in the air. Humiliation became his daily bread. I heard he tried to call some of his old friends, the fair-weather executives and investors who used to laugh at his jokes. Their secretaries suddenly didn't know who he was, or their numbers were disconnected. The real breaking point came at a pawn shop downtown. He walked in wearing the last vestiges of his old life, a sleek, Swiss-made chronograph watch. I had given it to him for his college graduation. "To a man who will always know the value of time," the inscription read. He slid it across the glass counter to a man with bored eyes who offered him a few $100s for a timepiece worth thousands. I can just picture Kevin's face, the twitch in his jaw, the war between his pride and the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He took the cash. He used it to fill the Civic's gas tank and buy a hot meal at a Waffle House, sitting in a booth alone, watching families laugh over their plates. That, I imagine, was rock bottom. Not losing the mansion or the company, but sitting in that sticky booth, realizing that not a single soul on earth was looking for him. He had built an empire of acquaintances and had no friends. He had a fiancée who loved his assets, not him. He had a father he had discarded like old rubbish. He had nothing. It was in that car, parked in the desolate quiet of a closed-down strip mall, that he must have finally emptied his pockets, searching for something, anything, and there it was. The brass key. Heavy, real. He had probably carried it for weeks, a bitter reminder of my final cutting words. But now, in the absolute zero of his existence, it must have looked different. It wasn't a symbol of what he had lost. It was the only thing he had left. It wasn't an insult. It was an invitation. A map. He sat there for a long time, I'm sure, just holding it, feeling its weight. The weight of my past and the terrifying, empty possibility of his own future. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that was entirely new to him, he put the key in the ignition. The old Honda's engine turned over with a weary groan. He pulled out of the parking lot and for the first time headed not towards the gleaming glass towers of downtown, but towards the rusted, forgotten industrial side of town, where the trains wailed in the night and old buildings held old secrets. Several months slid by, the way seasons change in Texas, slowly, then all at once. The searing heat of that summer faded into a crisp, golden autumn. I didn't reach out to Kevin. This wasn't a punishment I could cut short with a phone call. It was a journey he had to walk alone. You can't force a seed to sprout by digging it up every day to see if it's growing. You have to trust the soil, trust the sun, and have a little faith. I kept busy managing the trust's affairs from a small, rented office, making sure the foundations of what I'd built were still solid. But every single day, my thoughts drifted to that brass key and the boy I'd left sitting alone in that diner. One Tuesday morning, I woke up with a feeling in my gut. It wasn't anxiety. Not anymore. It was a quiet sort of pull, a sense that it was time. I drove my old Ford F-150, the one with a permanent scent of sawdust and motor oil, to a local spot and got 2 coffees in styrofoam cups, black, just the way I like it, and one with cream and sugar, the way his mother used to take hers. On an impulse, I also grabbed a small paper bag with a couple of glazed donuts. A peace offering, maybe. Or just a fatherly habit that was hard to shake. The drive to the industrial side of town was a drive back in time. Past the gleaming new tech campuses and high-rise condos, the landscape shifted to single-story warehouses and chain-link fences. It was the part of Austin that didn't make the travel brochures. I pulled my truck onto the gravel patch in front of the workshop, the suspension groaning in protest. For a long moment, I just sat there, engine off, looking at the place where it all began. The building itself was just as I'd left it, a simple, corrugated metal structure with a roll-up bay door. But something was different. The weeds that had choked the front steps were gone. The windows, once clouded with grime, were clean. And hanging squarely above the main door was a new sign. It wasn't slick or laser-cut like the ones Kevin had for his tech company. This one was hand-painted on a solid piece of plywood. The letters were steady and careful, painted in a simple dark blue. It read, Miller & Son. My breath caught in my chest. Not Miller Inc., not Miller Enterprises, Miller & Son. That ampersand, that little symbol connecting our names, felt heavier than any corporate logo. He hadn't just cleaned the place up. He was reclaiming a legacy. He was adding his name next to mine, not to stand on top of it, but to stand beside it. I grabbed the coffees and donuts and got out of the truck, my boots crunching on the gravel. The big bay door was open just enough to let the autumn sunlight spill inside. I peered in before making a sound. The inside was transformed. The chaotic mess of old tools and forgotten projects was gone. It was organized, swept clean. Tools hung neatly on a pegboard wall. Stacks of lumber were tidy and sorted by size. And in the center of the room, standing at a workbench, was Kevin. He was different. The designer suit was gone, replaced by a worn t-shirt and dusty jeans. His hair was a little longer, his face was leaner, and the perpetual 5 o'clock shadow of a late-night CEO had been replaced by the genuine bone-tired exhaustion of a man who works with his hands. He was sanding the edge of a large tabletop, his movements slow, focused, deliberate. There was no arrogance in his posture, no restless energy. There was only the gentle rasp of sandpaper on wood. The grit under his fingernails and the sawdust in his hair looked more authentic on him than any $1,000 watch ever had. I watched him for a full minute, my heart a confusing mix of pride and a dull, lingering ache for all the time we'd lost. He was so engrossed in his work he didn't hear me approach. I stepped inside, the light from the doorway momentarily casting my shadow over his workbench. He paused, then slowly looked up. His eyes, for so long guarded and sharp, were clear. He looked at me, then at the 2 coffee cups in my hand, and a flicker of something, surprise, relief, maybe even hope, crossed his face. I walked over and set the cups and the donut bag on a clear corner of the bench, next to a neat stack of blueprints. I looked down at the piece of furniture he was crafting. It was a dining table, built from solid oak. The joinery was clean, the lines were honest and strong. It was built to last. It was built to hold family meals and bear the weight of elbows and shared stories. I ran a hand over the smooth, sanded surface, feeling the strength of the wood. "Looks solid," I said, my voice coming out a little hoarse. I cleared my throat and looked him in the eye. "Need an extra pair of hands?" Kevin looked at my hand on the table, then back up at my face. The guarded mask he had worn for years finally crumbled. A small, genuine, and deeply humble smile touched his lips for the first time since he was a boy. It reached his eyes. "Yeah, Dad," he said, his own voice quiet but steady. "I'd appreciate that." I nodded, picking up my black coffee. He reached for the other one. There were no big speeches, no dramatic apologies, no rehashing of the past. It was all there in the clean workshop, in the solid piece of oak, and in the simple, shared understanding that passed between us. We had built an empire of glass and code that shattered. Now, here, in this dusty old workshop, with the smell of sawdust in the air, we were starting again, building something real, together.